Welcome back to the ECAG Navigator Journal podcast. I'm your host, Jack Newbould, and this is our first episode of 2026. Today, I'm joined by someone whose work I've genuinely admired from afar, Nicholas Thorne, better known across LinkedIn as Dr. Arms Trade. Nicholas holds a PhD in International Relations, serves as a Professor of International Relations at the University of Arizona, and is Director of Solutions Development at Defense Trade Solutions. A former Raytheon export compliance professional, what really sets Nicholas apart is his ability to translate dense, often intimidating language of export controls into something that engineers, business leaders, and program managers can actually act on. In today's conversation, we dig into how the AUKUS partnership and license-free environment are being misunderstood in practice, why releasability, not licensing, is the first step companies need to understand, and what responsible public commentary on export controls actually looks like. Whether you're an Australian SME just entering the defence space or a seasoned compliance professional, there's something in this one for you. Let's get into it. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Nicholas. I really do appreciate you taking the time, and I gather you're dialing in from Tucson, Arizona. How is everything this evening?
It is going great. It's a nice 71 degrees Fahrenheit. I think you said it was 21 degrees Celsius. I think is the
21 Celsius in the old money, Nick. Yep, that's right.
Yeah, it's been absolutely great here, and thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
No, not a problem, and thanks so much. ECAG, as you know, we're all about spreading the message around export control compliance and really being able to educate, especially our Australian SMEs, around that constant changing in policy across whether it's AUKUS countries or more broadly. And what really drew me to interview you today and reach out was just how clearly you communicate those fundamentals. And as I said, it's a great opportunity to meet you, and we'll crack on. So,
sounds like a plan.
Nick, you're widely known as Dr. Arms Trade through your LinkedIn commentary. How did that emerge, and what gap were you seeing in how export controls were being communicated publicly?
Yeah, so it's Dr. Arms Trade has kind of been in existence for about 5 years now, and kind of the backstory behind that is it actually began during the COVID time from around 2020, and it was almost by accident. At that point in time, I had just finished up working with Raytheon here in the U.S. as an export compliance associate there, and I spent about 5 years there, and I wanted to change. So I actually went over to the Tucson Police Department here and was doing work on kind of creating these dashboards for policing transparency. And the interesting piece of that is as I was going through that and spent about 2 years on that, is I realized that I really missed trade compliance. And I realized that may be a really odd thing to say, but kind of for me, export controls always kind of sat at this strange intersection of national security, industry, and geopolitics. And it was really interesting to me. And I just kind of sat there and was like, well, this job, although fulfilling for 2 years, I kind of really wanted to gravitate back towards export compliance. And at that point in time, I was also teaching a class at the University of Arizona on the arms trade. So kind of I randomly just one day, I think I recorded a lecture for my class and then recorded the same lecture to put on YouTube at that point in time. And they needed a name for it. I had a PhD, and I thought that Dr. Arms Trade was kind of it kind of rang nicely. And that's kind of how it all began. And I think my first video was on offsets. And for God's sakes, don't go onto the YouTube channel now, only in that I don't think I've updated it for about 2 years. I think the majority of my content now is on LinkedIn, or is at least geared towards kind of the LinkedIn audience. But I'm definitely going to go back and try to update that. But then I transitioned back into export compliance. I've been with Defense Trade Solutions now for about 4 years. And I think I was sitting in the airport in Dayton during a trip to a client where we were giving basic training to the client. I think my flight was delayed at that point in time. And we had gone to the client to train them on basic ITAR regulation, and everybody seemed very intimidated by that particular topic, right? So being able to explain it in kind of a more generalized term, or trying to be a translator to kind of this complex topic of trade compliance, I thought was really, really important. And I saw a gap there. And, during the 2-hour delay, I went ahead and I think I planned out about 2 months of Dr. Arms trade posts on LinkedIn, and then just kind of spawned from there. So I kind of really see it as being a translator of more complex export policy and trying to make it more accessible to not only those that are trying to go into export compliance initially, but also for the seasoned, business development person, or like the program manager, something like that, right? So it's really trying to make it more accessible and then better understood.
You earned your PhD in international relations and then moved into the defense sector. What inspired that transition, and how has your academic insight into arms proliferation shaped your day-to-day work in export compliance?
Yes, I think that it initially inspired me to go towards the defense sector after college, just because the majority of my research was on arms transfers and arms control issues. I think that most export compliance professionals, and understandably so, have a very operational and insular view of their role. They're kind of focused on getting licenses approved or ensuring filings are correct. And don't get me wrong, all of that is really, really important. But coming into export compliance with an academic background in the arms trade gave me, at least I feel, a much broader perspective on why these systems exist in the first place and kind of how they're evolving over time. Now, as far as like my academic research and the dissertation went, my research focused on how arms production dependence and international supply chains really shape state behavior and strategic relationships as a whole. And I think that lens fundamentally changes how you see export controls, which is what I've always tried to bring through in my channel. You really start to recognize that export controls aren't just regulatory hurdles, right? They're part of a larger system that governs technological advantage, alliance structure, and even market competition. So, I mean, for example, over the past 20 years, the internationalization of the defense supply chain itself has made export controls far more central to how defense programs function. Components, software, technical data, they're all constantly moving across borders, and export controls are kind of now embedded directly into the production system itself. And then at the same time, arms importing countries have been actively diversifying their suppliers to reduce dependence on any one single partner, especially, or at least in the past year or two, the United States, and we kind of see that active shift going on in Europe. So that in and of itself has kind of increased competition on the global arms market. And in that environment, export compliance isn't just about preventing violations, right? It's about enabling companies to move quickly. It's about trying to access the markets early and trying to remain competitive. Now, as far as like my dissertation goes, my research primarily focused, at least for my dissertation, on the role that arms transfers play in conflicts, and primarily interstate conflict. And that perspective stayed with me. To me, defense articles and technologies that we export each and every day aren't abstract. I understand that their effects are real, and a lot of times they're rather immediate as well. So, I don't necessarily know if that perspective makes me more effective in a purely technical sense, but I do think it keeps me grounded. To me, export compliance isn't just a regulatory exercise. It's rather part of a system that has real strategic and human consequences. And I think having that awareness has helped me approach the work with the seriousness and clarity that I think that it deserves.
I'm interested to know around when export control reforms like AUKUS between Australia, the US and UK and the LFE are announced publicly, what do you listen for in the language being used to assess whether they'll be understood correctly or misunderstood almost immediately?
I think anytime that I hear the word free or I hear the exemption, I pretty much know that it's likely going to be misinterpreted in some way. So I think in Australia, the license-free environment is kind of the language that you all use. Now, in the U.S., we primarily use the term exemption. And what that essentially means is you don't necessarily have to go through the same licensing pathways in order to try to export some good. Now, the great piece about that is it obviously lowers the kind of regulatory burden as far as, I don't necessarily have to draft a DSP-5 or an LOT, but what I see as the larger issue there is a lot of times if a company isn't necessarily versed on the export compliance, rules, they tend to think that an exemption means that you don't have to have a license for anything, or you don't necessarily have to do anything to go ahead and export out a process, right? So in my experience, exemptions are often interpreted, as meaning that you don't need to do anything in order to export the actual product. And that's almost never the case, right? So what exemptions like AUKUS really do is remove or modify the traditional authorization pathways. So you may not need to make a DSP-5, or you may not need to draft a TEA in certain circumstances, which does reduce the friction in a procedural sense, but it doesn't remove the responsibility. And in many ways, it just shifts more responsibility onto the company that's looking to do the export, right? Because the government isn't taking as large of a part in the actual export itself. But you still need to know, or you still need to understand whether your technology is actually eligible for the exemption itself. So as far as AUKUS goes, the excluded technology list still is extensive. A lot of technologies are still going to require a traditional authorization. And then on top of that, even if you do qualify for it, you still need to maintain the proper records behind it as well. You still need to keep track of your exports. You still need to keep track of kind of those technical conversations or the shipments of technical data that's going back and forth between the countries. One of the biggest risks I see is what I would call spillover. It's basically where organizations become comfortable in operating under an exemption and then begin to start to assume that it applies more broadly than it actually does. And that's where compliance and especially tech security risks tend to emerge. And what I mean by that is oftentimes, let's say that you have a U.S. company that wants to go ahead and export technical data or a particular product over to Australia. And the initial product is classified in such a way under the USML that it obviously qualifies for AUKUS. But then over time, if the reinforcement as far as the guardrails of how you would use that exemption, if those aren't reinforced to those actually doing the export, what tends to happen is they think that they can just go ahead and export everything else. So I really think it's important that the guardrails are really understood up front. And unfortunately, I think it's just, it's an issue with companies which may not have a mature compliance department in the way that a lot of times I see the risks associated with that, to where it just kind of spreads out to where I was clear to export this particular product, and then over time it just shifts to others which may not actually be covered.
I guess what would be interesting to know as well is in that space of tech security and sort of need to know concepts, and they can be incredibly hard to explain. And I know for some of our SMEs in Australia, we're creating some amazing tech, and sometimes,
Sure.
I speak to businesses and defense leaders as well who do note that people may not know what they can say, how to communicate it. And I wondered, how do you communicate these ideas with either, I guess, diluting the risk or alarming people unnecessarily?
Sure, that's a great question, and it's a really interesting topic that has been coming up more and more often, especially because what AUKUS was really meant to do was transmit, or at least allow the transmission of what the U.S. would consider highly sensitive data, right? Because we do want to kind of bolster our alliance in our defense relationship. Usually, what I do as far as tech security goes, and I'm sure that I actually just posted on LinkedIn today, and some of the comments directly talked about the issue of tech security and releasability, and I guess that's really what I kind of frame it in the sense of releasability. So when we're talking about tech security, I try to make it more understandable by framing it around this more broad concept of releasability. And releasability is really the foundational issue here. So before you even go get an export authorization, you're going to need to know whether the U.S. government is going to be even willing to allow that particular piece of technology to be shared with a foreign partner at all. Right? So that comes prior to any company ever even trying to look or apply for an export authorization. Export licensing and releasability are related, but they're not the same thing, right? So releasability comes first. The government is going to determine that the technology can be released from a national security and technology protection perspective. And only after that determination can the export authorization process then move, right? But part of what makes this difficult for companies is that technology security and foreign disclosure as well, those processes like releasability reviews and AT considerations, those aren't clearly spelled out in the ITAR itself. I mean, if I had a nickel for every time that I've had a client come to me asking me about the technology security and foreign disclosure process because they found out about it through the proviso on a particular license, I would be a rich man, right? There is nothing in the ITAR itself which really speaks to kind of this tech security and releasability aspect of goods. But releasability determinations often happen through separate Department of Defense processes. That separation makes it harder for companies, especially newer entrants, not these large primes, to understand kind of the full landscape and how to process that. What I see frequently, again, is the companies assuming that export licensing is going to be the point in which they start, when in reality, releasability is going to be that initial gatekeeper. So they may submit a license application and only later discover that additional requirements tied to technology protection and disclosures are going to limit what they can and can't export. So large defense primes are very familiar with these particular processes and have a lot of really robust internal infrastructure built around those. But for smaller companies that enter this defense space, releasability and anti-tamper requirements often come as a surprise, mostly in the form of a proviso on a particular license. So when I communicate about these topics publicly, I try to simplify the topics without diluting the importance of those particular things. Export controls aren't just administrative. They're part of a broader system designed to ensure that sensitive technologies are shared deliberately and in a way that security advantage of both the U.S., Australia, and the United Kingdom as a whole. So the topics are tough, but once you kind of couch it in this understanding that on the initial front, you basically have to ask the government, hey, can I even release this to the foreign foreign partner? And then the USG is going to review that particular piece of tech. And then if something needs to be protected, then obviously the U.S. company, and I'm speaking strictly from a U.S. company perspective, but if there are any requirements for protection that are going to need to be made, then obviously the U.S. contractor is going to have to do that. So I do see most of the time that once you couch it more in this kind of releasability perspective, which is separate from your export authorizations, it really tends to hit home.
Nick, in terms of responsibility, you've touched on that a few times today. What do visible commentators, individuals, and organisations like ECAG have in shaping export controls so that they're understood, not just announced?
Yeah, I think that's the issue that we're all trying to deal with, right? Export compliance and kind of the language around it is rather complex. And they're often export controls are often communicated in one of two ways. Either it's very dense legal language, or it's in a way that tends to focus almost entirely on penalties and risks, right? And I think both approaches can make the topic feel inaccessible and frankly intimidating to those companies which are really trying to take part in this larger export market. And this is doubly important for those who are brand new to the field too. I mean, once a company has decided to go into kind of the defense realm and they take a look at a lot of these controls and the way that they're written, there's a lot of intimidation associated with that. They see these things as very complex and, oh God, I'm going to have to hire a lawyer, or I'm going to have to hire a law firm. And that's not necessarily the case. I think it's really, really important for us that are kind of on the forefront of this field to be able to be translators, right? I think that's part of the complexity, I feel like, comes from the fact that export compliance has traditionally been seen as the purview of lawyers. And while legal interpretation, I think, is really, really important, the practical reality is that engineers, program managers, those in business development or just business leaders as a whole are the ones that are interacting with export controls each and every day. And if they don't understand these things, then compliance becomes reactive instead of deliberate. So I've also seen a degree of gatekeeping around export controls, partly because they're so misunderstood. People assume that the complexity itself has value or that it needs to remain hard to understand. But I don't believe that that's productive, right, for industry or for national security, for which these export controls are meant to protect. So my approach has always kind of been rooted in being able to translate it to a degree that the kind of average person who's on the ground actually trying to export these goods or trying to sell these goods can understand exactly the boundaries of what they can and can't do. And I think the reason why I've always seen translation as a really, really important part of kind of the key thing that I've tried to do is because in my PhD program, I initially had a hard time with statistics. Math was not my thing, right? I think I took calc twice, and I think I got a C the second time, right? So stats was hard, right? So it was my first semester of grad school, and I think I got a B in both of my advanced stats classes. And for the next year, we got our teaching assignments, and I was assigned to teach stats. And the reason why they did that is because they thought that, okay, if he's having an issue with stats, then let's have him learn it because now he has to teach it. And what that forced me to do was get over kind of my fear or my thought that stats was this really, really kind of complex thing. What that experience taught me is that once you truly understand something, you can begin to explain it in a way that kind of removes that intimidation without removing the seriousness of that particular topic. And I try to approach export controls in the same way. At their core, they aren't necessarily that tough to understand. They exist because governments need visibility and control over sensitive technologies and how those move across borders. And once you understand kind of that 60,000 foot level, the regulatory structure tends to make a lot more sense. So I think that public communicators have a responsibility to explain export controls clearly and honestly as well, without diluting their importance, but without also making them seem inaccessible, right? Because ultimately what these controls are trying to do is to create better compliance, and better compliance supports both national security and responsible technology sharing. So I think it's really, really important for us to, although we may not be able to fully control the language of the export control regulations which are coming out, I think it's our responsibility as those of us who are experts in this particular field to know how to translate it. So those on the ground who are actively dealing with these things, selling and exporting defense goods, fully understand kind of those boundaries and guardrails of what they can and can't do.
If you could change one thing about how export controls are discussed publicly, either here in America, what would it be?
I think you saw the highlights in my LinkedIn post today. And the point of my LinkedIn post today was that the ITAR is not a death sentence to foreign programs, right? So integrating some type of ITAR controlled good into a foreign good doesn't necessarily mean that the US government is going to own that particular product. And it doesn't mean that you can't export that particular product. It just means you may have to go through one or two more steps. All right. So if I could change one thing, it would be the perception that the ITAR is really something to fear. I think that there's a widespread belief internationally that what's sometimes called ITAR taint, right, that it makes a system unusable or removes control from the originating company. And that's not really an accurate characterization of what the ITAR does. What the ITAR just does is it's going to introduce an authorization requirement, and that's not always the case. You would have to check if whoever you're going to export to is going to require an authorization. It doesn't eliminate foreign ownership of that particular good. It doesn't prevent companies from operating globally either. It just means that transfers involving that particular technology, which may have come from the US, needs to go through a defined export control process. In practice, thousands of companies around the world successfully build and export things that incorporate US ITAR controlled components. And the key is the understanding that the regulatory framework and integrating export compliance into the program early rather than treating it as an afterthought. So if you are going to bring something in that is going to be ITAR controlled, at least be able to understand kind of the basic guardrails of what you can and can't do with that product or what may require an authorization. But that's all that it may be, is you may have to go get an authorization to export that particular product, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that the U.S. now owns it. And I think that that's a really big myth that I consistently try to push against. And actually, I was dealing with a client, an Australian client last month that had the same thought, was going, okay, well, how much technical data can we intake from the U.S. Defense Department until we don't own it? And it's going, well, it's not necessarily that you don't own it. It just means that there's going to be ITAR control associated with that. And that's only if we look at what was actually provided, if that actually is ITAR controlled technical data. And if so, that just means you have to file for a license or something once in a while. But it's definitely not a death sentence. And I kind of wish that would stop being a big thing.
Nick, thank you so much for your time today. I know our audiences really will enjoy your commentary, your insight, and the various different topics that we've covered today. And that's a wrap on today's episode. A huge thank you to Nicholas Thorne for giving us so much of his time and insight. What I took away most from our conversation is that theme of responsibility. Export controls are not just a regulatory checkbox. They carry real strategic and human consequences, and understanding them properly is how Australian business can move quickly, compete globally, and stay on the right side of an increasingly complex landscape. If you found today's episode useful, please share it with someone in your network who needs to hear it, particularly any SMEs navigating the AUKUS opportunity for the first time. You can find Nicholas on LinkedIn, and as always, you can find us at ecag.com.au. I'm Jack Newbould. Thanks for listening to the first ECAG Navigator Journal podcast of 2026, and we'll see you next time.